The moment the palace realized what Queen Camilla had been building behind closed doors, it was already far too late to stop the panic spreading through the royal household. For months, while the public believed the monarchy was united around the illness of King Charles III, another operation had been moving silently through the corridors of power, hidden beneath routine paperwork, buried under ceremonial language, disguised so carefully that even experienced palace staff failed to understand what they were processing until the structure was almost complete. The timing was what horrified people most. Charles was weak. The palace was distracted. Senior aides were consumed with protecting the image of stability while the king battled cancer behind the scenes. Every conversation inside Buckingham Palace revolved around survival, succession, public confidence, and damage control. Nobody imagined that during one of the most fragile moments in modern royal history, someone inside the institution would attempt to move so bold, so deeply personal, and so politically dangerous that it threatened to ignite a silent civil war inside the monarchy itself. But according to multiple palace insiders, that is exactly what happened. Camilla had allegedly begun laying the groundwork to secure permanent royal elevation for her own bloodline, not through public announcements, not through official debate, but through a slow, invisible administrative campaign designed to become irreversible before anyone fully understood what they were looking at. The names at the center of the operation were her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, two figures Queen Elizabeth had reportedly made absolutely certain would never formally enter the royal structure when she approved Charles and Camilla's marriage in 2005. That condition had been one of the late Queen's most guarded lines. Camilla could marry Charles. She could eventually become Queen Consort. But her family, her children, her branch of bloodline, would remain outside the institution permanently. No titles. No ceremonial status. No official pathway inward. The monarchy would absorb Camilla, but not the legacy attached to her past. Palace veterans say Elizabeth viewed that boundary as non-negotiable because she understood something the institution feared admitting publicly. The British public would never fully accept the children of the woman associated with the collapse of Diana, Princess of Wales, being folded into the same hierarchy as Diana's sons and grandchildren. 4 years that line held because Elizabeth was alive, feared, respected, and institutionally untouchable. But when she died, something shifted. Staff members later described Camilla not as emotional or relieved after Elizabeth's passing, but focused. Intensely focused. Like someone who had spent decades waiting for a locked door to finally open. Within months, subtle changes reportedly began appearing across internal palace systems. Minor ceremonial wording adjustments. Attendance classifications rewritten. Guest categories modified. Small enough individually to escape scrutiny, but together forming what one insider later described as an invisible staircase. Camilla allegedly understood that a direct request for titles would trigger immediate resistance from Prince William, from senior constitutional advisors, and most dangerously from Princess Anne, whose loyalty to Elizabeth's institutional boundaries bordered on ruthless. So instead of attacking the system head-on, the operation moved underneath it. Quietly. Patiently. Methodically. Draft language reportedly circulated proposing honorary recognition structures tied to extended ceremonial family participation, terminology so dry and bureaucratic that almost nobody paid attention to it at first. But buried inside that language was the beginning of something explosive, a pathway through which Tom and Laura could gradually be repositioned closer to royal legitimacy without the public ever witnessing a single dramatic announcement. And according to one longtime palace employee, the strategy depended on one terrifying assumption, that King Charles, exhausted by treatment and emotionally dependent on Camilla, would eventually sign whatever was placed in front of him. That detail became the part insiders found hardest to forgive. During periods of treatment, Charles reportedly relied heavily on pre-prepared document packages assembled by trusted staff to keep royal administration functioning while he recovered privately. Sources claim individuals connected to Camilla's office saw an opportunity inside that vulnerability. Papers connected to ceremonial restructuring allegedly began appearing among routine state documents requiring little scrutiny. Individually harmless. Collectively transformative. By the time anyone higher up recognized the broader pattern, several foundational approvals may already have been moving through internal channels. What makes the story even darker is that the public was unknowingly watching part of the strategy unfold in real time. At the coronation in 2023, when Camilla's grandsons appeared prominently during official ceremonies and later stood visibly within royal presentation spaces traditionally reserved for core heirs and working royals, most viewers saw warmth, family unity, and grandmotherly pride. But inside palace circles, some interpreted it very differently. Not as sentiment, but as positioning. A visual normalization campaign. An attempt to place Camilla's bloodline beside the future of the monarchy, often enough that the public would eventually stop questioning it. That was the alleged genius of the operation. Never force acceptance all at once. Introduce it slowly, quietly, emotionally. Make the public feel cruel for resisting it. Make the institution feel outdated for opposing it. Then lock the structure into place administratively before anyone can organize resistance. And according to sources close to the household, the only person who saw the full picture early enough to understand the danger was Princess Anne. Because while the rest of the palace was distracted by illness, public relations, and survival, and had allegedly been watching Camilla's office for years, documenting patterns, tracking procedural changes, and waiting for the moment when suspicion finally turned into proof. And when that proof arrived, hidden inside a trail of paperwork nobody else had bothered to follow, what and uncovered would reportedly trigger one of the most explosive internal confrontations the modern monarchy has ever faced. For nearly 2 years, according to insiders who later spoke in whispers behind palace walls, Princess Anne had been quietly building a private record of everything connected to Queen Camilla's expanding influence inside the institution. Not gossip. Not emotion. Evidence. And understood something most people around her brother refused to accept. Power inside the monarchy no longer moved through dramatic declarations or public fights. Real power moved through procedure, access, classification, proximity, invitations, ceremonial positioning, and paperwork so boring that almost nobody important ever bothered reading it carefully. That was where Camilla operated best. Not loudly. Invisibly. Palace staff later described and during this period as colder than they had ever seen her. Focused. Watching everything. Speaking very little. She reportedly began requesting internal ceremonial drafts personally instead of allowing summaries to reach her through aides. She started reviewing attendance structures for state functions line by line. She questioned classification updates that other royals would never even notice. At first, some staff believed and was simply becoming more protective of the institution after Queen Elizabeth's death. But what nobody understood at the time was that, and already suspected, Camilla was attempting something far bigger than social positioning. The turning point allegedly came when a senior administrative employee, someone who had processed palace paperwork for more than 3 decades, requested a private meeting with and after repeatedly trying and failing to raise concerns through normal channels. That detail sent fear through the household afterward because it suggested something deeply unsettling. The system itself may already have been compromised. According to sources familiar with the meeting, the employee explained that documents linked to Camilla's office were being quietly cleared no matter how unusual they appeared. Questions disappeared. Objections vanished. Requests returned approved without explanation. The employee reportedly told and that the paperwork did not look dangerous at first glance, which was exactly what made it so alarming. Each individual change seemed meaningless. A ceremonial classification altered here. A designation adjusted there. A seating protocol rewritten. But taken together, they formed a gradual institutional migration placing Camilla's relatives closer and closer to formal royal integration. And allegedly listened without interrupting once. When the employee finished speaking, she stood, gathered the files herself, and said only 4 words, "Leave this with me." What happened next terrified people who later learned about it, and began tracing everything personally. Every signature, every routing approval, every administrative modification connected to Camilla's office over the previous 18 months. And the deeper she dug, the darker the pattern became. Hidden beneath layers of harmless bureaucratic language was what one insider later called a shadow succession structure, not a challenge to the throne itself, but an attempt to permanently insert Camilla's bloodline into ceremonial royal legitimacy before William inherited the crown. and reportedly discovered draft proposals for honorary distinctions linked to royal service orders that could be personally granted by the sovereign without parliamentary debate. That was the genius of the alleged strategy. If Charles signed them quietly, the titles would become institutional fact overnight. Reversing them afterward would trigger public scandal, constitutional embarrassment, and potentially devastating media warfare inside the monarchy. But the document that allegedly changed everything was not a title request. It was a ceremonial role assignment attached to an upcoming state function. Buried inside an early draft was the name Laura Lopez, positioned in a space historically reserved for working royals only, and reportedly stared at the page in silence for nearly a full minute after reading it. Because that single line revealed the true endgame. The operation was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Camilla was not simply seeking private recognition for her family. She was allegedly preparing to place them physically, publicly, photographically inside royal state structures where future normalization would become almost impossible to reverse. And once and understood that, the investigation transformed into a war. Sources say she immediately locked down every related document, removed sensitive files from standard circulation systems, and began assembling what insiders later described as the audit, a comprehensive internal record designed not merely to expose Camilla's actions, but to make denial impossible. Staff who encountered and during those weeks described the atmosphere around her as frighteningly calm. No shouting. No panic. Just precision. Meanwhile, completely unaware that the walls were closing around her, Camilla reportedly continued pushing forward aggressively. She allegedly believed Charles would protect her if resistance emerged because he always had before. That belief became the emotional center of the entire collapse. Palace insiders say Camilla had built her survival inside the monarchy around one assumption, that when the moment truly came, Charles would ultimately choose her over the institution, over public pressure, even over his own children if necessary. It was the belief that carried her through decades of hatred, scandal, humiliation, and isolation. But what she failed to understand was that Charles's illness had changed the emotional gravity inside the palace. As his health weakened, the center of long-term institutional power had already begun shifting toward Prince William and behind the scenes. Senior officials increasingly viewed them as the monarchy's future stabilizers. And once finished assembling the evidence, she allegedly made a decision that stunned even some of Charles's closest advisors. Before confronting Camilla, she would first confront the king himself. According to multiple insiders, and entered Charles's private sitting room carrying the complete audit file and closed the door behind her. Nobody knows every word spoken inside that conversation. But several sources agree on one devastating detail, and reportedly warned her brother that if he attempted to interfere after the confrontation, if he used his authority to shield Camilla from consequences, she would escalate the matter beyond internal palace containment entirely. The implication was catastrophic. Exposure, public scandal, media war, constitutional humiliation during a cancer crisis. Charles allegedly listened in complete silence while and laid out the evidence piece by piece. The classifications, the ceremonial pathways, the role assignments, the manipulated administrative structures, the positioning strategy surrounding Camilla's family, and most dangerously of all, the timing during the king's illness. When finished, Charles reportedly gave no defense of his wife. No argument. No denial. Nothing. And according to insiders, that silence told and everything she needed to know before she walked directly toward the confrontation that would finally destroy the operation forever. The confrontation inside Clarence House reportedly lasted less than 15 minutes, but according to sources familiar with what happened behind those closed doors, it permanently shattered whatever fragile balance still existed between Queen Camilla, King Charles III, Princess Anne, and ultimately Prince William himself. By the time Anne arrived carrying the audit file, the alleged Operation Camilla had spent years building was already collapsing internally. Staff had begun whispering. Administrative access points were quietly being frozen. Certain ceremonial approvals had suddenly stopped moving through the system. The invisible machine Camilla allegedly relied upon no longer responded the way it once had, and for the first time since Queen Elizabeth's death, people inside the palace began realizing that the future Queen Mother-style influence Camilla imagined for herself might never happen at all. Sources say and entered without ceremony, placed the documents directly in front of Camilla, and began walking through the evidence piece by piece with a kind of cold precision that made interruption impossible. Every hidden classification, every procedural alteration, every rerouted attendance structure, every ceremonial adjustment tied to Tom Parker Bowles or Laura Lopez, every quiet pathway that would eventually have allowed Camilla's bloodline to stand closer and closer beside the official royal family until separation itself became meaningless. Insiders later claimed Camilla initially tried to dismiss parts of it as administrative misunderstanding, but that defense reportedly collapsed the moment and produced the ceremonial draft placing Laura Lopez into a role historically reserved for working royals only. According to one source, and did not raise her voice once. That was what made the room so terrifying. She simply looked at Camilla and said, "This ends now." And in that exact moment, something inside Camilla allegedly broke because she finally understood the scale of what and had uncovered. Not fragments. Not rumors. Everything. The hidden architecture beneath the operation had been exposed completely. Sources claim Camilla's first instinct was not anger but desperation. She allegedly asked for Charles immediately, believing the king would intervene once the situation became real. That belief had protected her psychologically for decades. Charles had failed her publicly many times before, but she always convinced herself he was surviving strategically, waiting for the correct moment to stand beside her when it mattered most. But this time was different, and reportedly informed her that Charles already knew everything. Worse than that, he had chosen silence. Palace insiders later described that revelation as the true emotional detonation point of the entire crisis. Because according to people close to Camilla, she could survive public hatred, press humiliation, royal coldness, even institutional isolation, so long as she believed Charles remained emotionally hers above all else. But hearing that he had been warned in advance, shown the evidence, and still refused to protect her allegedly hit with devastating force. One source claimed Camilla physically sat down and stared at the documents without speaking for nearly a full minute after hearing Charles would not intervene. Another described the room afterward as the sound of somebody realizing the ground beneath them was never solid to begin with, and reportedly delivered the final blow before leaving. She warned that if any further attempt was made to reposition Camilla's family within royal structures, the matter would no longer remain contained privately inside palace walls. Then she walked out, taking most of the file with her, leaving behind only enough evidence for Camilla to understand that the entire operation was finished. But what followed over the next 48 hours was allegedly even more shocking than the confrontation itself. Because once the audit reached William, the future king responded with a level of fury that stunned even senior aides who already knew how deeply unresolved his feelings toward Camilla remained. According to insiders, William reviewed the material personally and reacted almost immediately. His answer was described as brutally simple: no. No titles. No integration. No ceremonial legitimacy for Camilla's bloodline under his future reign. Sources claim William stated clearly that the monarchy belonged to the direct heirs of the throne, to Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, and not to what one insider described as parallel family structures built through manipulation. But behind that institutional language was something far more personal and emotionally volatile. People close to William say the revelations reignited years of buried anger connected to the destruction of his parents' marriage and the long shadow cast by the suffering of Diana, Princess of Wales. To William, according to sources, this was not merely a constitutional issue. It was an attempt by the woman forever linked in public memory to Diana's pain to permanently insert her own legacy into the royal bloodstream beside Diana's children and grandchildren. That was the line he would never allow crossed. What happened next reportedly resembled less an internal correction and more a complete institutional demolition. Every classification change tied to Camilla's office was frozen pending review. Proposed ceremonial pathways were terminated instantly. Internal designation categories allegedly created to normalize extended ceremonial household participation were erased entirely from draft structures. But William went even further. According to palace insiders, he introduced new oversight mechanisms requiring future ceremonial reclassifications to pass through his office directly before implementation. In practical terms, it meant Camilla's administrative freedom inside the palace had effectively ended overnight. The invisible corridors where she allegedly operated for years no longer existed. And then came the detail that reportedly humiliated her most deeply of all. A broader audit ordered by William allegedly uncovered multiple earlier incidents where palace procedures had quietly shifted in ways benefiting Camilla's relatives socially, ceremonially, or institutionally. None individually explosive. Together devastating. Because they appeared to confirm an central fear, that the title operation had not been an isolated emotional decision during Charles's illness, but the climax of a much longer strategy unfolding slowly since Queen Elizabeth's death. By that point, insiders say the atmosphere inside Clarence House had turned emotionally radioactive. Staff spoke in whispers. Calls reportedly went unanswered. Camilla withdrew almost completely from certain private interactions. And according to one account repeated quietly among palace circles afterward, a member of household staff entered Camilla's private sitting room days later and noticed something deeply symbolic. Every framed photograph of Charles had disappeared from the room entirely. Not from public spaces. Only from the private room she used most. When the staff member allegedly hesitated too long looking at the empty spaces, Camilla reportedly erupted, screaming for them to leave immediately. For people inside the palace, that moment became symbolic of the entire collapse. Not simply the destruction of a hidden operation, but the destruction of the one belief Camilla had depended upon for survival inside the monarchy, that when the final line was drawn, Charles would stand beside her no matter the cost. He didn't. And once William entered the fight, the future of Camilla's influence inside the monarchy changed forever. What happened after Prince William dismantled the operation was not loud, public, or dramatic in the way royal scandals are usually imagined by the outside world. There were no emergency press conferences, no screaming headlines confirming the truth, no palace official stepping in front of cameras to admit that a hidden institutional war had just exploded behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. The monarchy survives by burying fire under silence, and according to insiders, that is exactly what happened here. But inside the royal household itself, people understood immediately that something irreversible had changed. For the first time since Queen Camilla entered royal life, the invisible influence she had spent decades building no longer frightened anyone at the top of the institution. The power had shifted completely. Palace staff reportedly noticed it in small, devastating ways first. Meetings once routed quietly through Camilla's private office suddenly required secondary approvals. Invitations linked to ceremonial planning stopped moving automatically. Long-standing aides connected closely to her office found themselves excluded from sensitive discussions without explanation. The corridors that once opened for her began closing one by one. According to one senior insider, the palace stopped trusting the architecture around her. And in an institution built entirely on trust, access, and controlled proximity to power, that kind of loss is fatal. But the true final blow allegedly came when Princess Anne pushed forward the institutional protection Queen Elizabeth had never managed to formalize before her death. Sources claim Anne drafted a standing household directive designed not merely to stop Camilla's alleged operation permanently, but to make any future attempt structurally impossible under future reigns as well. The proposed language reportedly required that no ceremonial elevation, royal honor, household integration, or title pathway connected to Camilla's bloodline could proceed in the future without broader institutional review beyond the authority of a single sovereign alone. If accurate, the significance of that move cannot be overstated. It would mean that the boundary Queen Elizabeth once enforced privately as a personal condition of Charles's marriage would now survive as written institutional doctrine long after Charles himself is gone. In other words, the monarchy would no longer merely remember the line, it would become the line. And according to insiders, William supported the move completely. That detail terrified some within royal circles because it revealed how fully aligned Anne and William had become behind the scenes during Charles's illness. The old emotional center of royal authority, Charles and Camilla, had weakened, while the future structure of power quietly consolidated around Anne's institutional discipline and William's generational authority as future king. Several palace veterans later described the shift as the true beginning of the post-Charles monarchy, even while Charles still sits on the throne. And perhaps the darkest part of the entire story is what insiders claim about Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez themselves. According to people familiar with the aftermath, neither of Camilla's children were directly involved in the alleged operation at all. They reportedly had no active role in the internal maneuvering, no participation in the administrative pathways, no awareness of the full scale of what their mother was allegedly attempting behind palace walls. If true, it transforms the scandal from simple ambition into something far more psychologically tragic. Camilla was not merely fighting for status. She was allegedly trying to force history itself to validate her bloodline inside an institution that never fully accepted her, and she did it alone. That realization reportedly changed how even some critics inside the palace viewed the collapse afterward. Not with sympathy exactly, but with a kind of cold recognition of desperation. Because beneath all the strategy, secrecy, manipulation, and ambition was still a woman who had spent decades surviving hatred inside the most emotionally brutal institution on earth, convincing herself that one day she would finally secure permanence for her family beside the crown. Instead, according to insiders, the exact opposite happened. The alleged operation did not elevate her family. It triggered the construction of permanent institutional barriers against them. It did not strengthen her influence. It exposed it. It did not bring her closer to the future monarchy. It pushed her further outside of it than at any point since her marriage to Charles. And perhaps most devastatingly of all, when the entire structure began collapsing around her, the one person she believed would always cross the fire for her, King Charles III, remained silent. That silence now hangs over the palace more heavily than any official statement ever could. Because in monarchies, silence is rarely empty. Silence is choice. Silence is alignment. Silence decides who survives history and who is quietly abandoned to it. And according to the whispers still moving through royal circles, Camilla finally discovered the truth too late. She had spent years mastering the shadows of the monarchy, but the moment the future king and the last true guardian of Queen Elizabeth's system turned to face her together, the shadows disappeared all at once.